if you're very, very fortunate, like my friend Barry Buzan, then writing comes really naturally to you and it just flows out of you. But very few of us are like that. And for me, it's very often like pulling teeth. It's very hard to find headspace and time. So the actual writing is a creative process, you know. So sometimes I feel like a spoiled artist in a way, where I have days where nothing comes out because I can't make it happen. Sometimes it's months when I can't. So that is the biggest struggle of all. Should I just continue? Then you can.
No, let's start again. How are you, Evelyn?
I'm very well. It's a beautiful day and I'm very happy to be here.
Yes, it's very sunny and we are surrounded by kangaroo paw. And we will talk a little bit more about your work, your key works that I really like and inspire me. But before that, perhaps we can start with discussing your early career, your start, because your start is what a lot of perhaps American trained would say a bit unorthodox, because you come to this from a very, you know, diverse background. And do you feel like you were at a disadvantage when you first started? And do you feel like you need to play catch up?
No, I have never felt disadvantaged. Quite the opposite. I feel like I've had a very advantageous, privileged background for studying all the things that I study today. I am classically trained. I'm old enough to have been trained in an era where we still had an understanding of what the foundational disciplines were, which were essential for anything you go on to do in your graduate career. And my first degree was in geography, which, as many people might know, it's an integrative discipline that has both elements of natural sciences as well as social sciences. And so it's always come very naturally to me to combine qualitative and quantitative work, for example, and to place as much emphasis on data in the sense of comparable, quantitative data, as much emphasis on that as emphasis on, quality of interviews and surveys and questions of how do we appropriately and with integrity, draw or glean insights into human behavior and human motivations. So that kind of background, I think, has set me up perfectly well for the kinds of research questions I've got on to explore in international relations and regional security. It's not a million miles away.
So what drives you to the field?
Well, I mean, let's define my space. I see myself as a scholar of international relations and security of East Asia. Those are my self-ascribed primary fields. And I came to them, I guess, like with most people, in an evolutionary way. I, from a classical background in geography, first moved towards, in my master's study, questions of environment and development when I began to slightly specialize. And when I did that, I did a body of independent research on transboundary management of the Mekong River, which, as many people will know, is the major international river system that runs across from China into mainland Southeast Asia. And that very naturally, the transboundary nature of that very naturally brought me into contact with aspects of international law, international relations. And so it was really quite pragmatic. My first foray into international relations was because of having to gain new tools, analytical and conceptual, to think about multiple countries having to negotiate with each other and to jointly manage, a river that flows across a number of different countries. So that initially was extremely pragmatic. And once I got into it, I realized that international relations is another one of these, what I call magpie disciplines. All my PhD students know this. I say very frankly that international relations is not a fundamental discipline. It is a derived discipline. It is an advanced body of study precisely because it draws upon a variety of different foundational disciplines. And so that I found very attractive because it has the potential, again, to do integrative studies, which are far more challenging and far more interesting than simply doing one thing.
One of your first major work would be your book, Constructing the U.S. Rapprochement with China, 1961 to 74, from Red Menace to Tacit Ally. And I found the word constructing fascinating because you really grab on that word and really seriously demonstrate that there's internal dynamic at work. This is not a natural thing. It's actually something that is constructed. And this allowed the US to change its negative perceptions of China that allowed them to transform relationships. So construction is not just a word for you, but it's a real thing that you really fleshed out and unpacked. And what was your eureka moment, so to speak, when you start conceptualizing this project?
There was no eureka moment, and it was very typical of all doctoral theses in the sense that I began with, yes, I'm interested in US-China relations, and I came from a department, the Oxford Department of International Relations, in which it was very natural to take a combined interest both in diplomatic history as well as area study. At that time when I was doing that PhD, the cutting edge of archival declassification was the Nixon period. We knew that the Nixon archival materials would be declassified during my period of study as a DPhil student, and which is why really the study starts in 61, which is the Kennedy administration, goes through the Johnson administration, and then brings in the new material from the Nixon administration. So there was no eureka moment in that sense, but the big contribution in terms of diplomatic history of that work is that I was one of the very first scholars to actually look comprehensively at the Nixon papers vis-a-vis China policy, which of course was terribly exciting, right? The major thing I was trying to do in that book really was to do what I called conceptual diplomatic history, right? I think that diplomatic history is a craft for which I have a great deal of respect, and I think that it's much harder to do than people might think. It's not merely a case of let's run to the archives and find as many relevant documents as possible. The art of crafting good diplomatic history takes a long time and takes a great deal of maturity to deliver well. What I wanted to do was that. I wanted to do that really well, but I also wanted to show that we can actually bring it to a different level, right? If we employed, as you said, slightly more purposeful, conceptually inflected frameworks that would give it more sharpness and would bring out the significance of what we are finding in the diplomatic history work. And of course, the U.S.-China, the change in the U.S.-China relationship that came from 1969 onwards, particularly, was the biggest turning point in the Cold War.
Yes.
People forget this, right? The fact that, the U.S.-China rapprochement was negotiated under the Nixon administration entirely changed the complexion of the Cold War, quite entirely, right? So there was the sort of big, significant historical juncture that I was trying to study anyway.
Yeah, and have you always been that intentional and purposeful? And I think one of the things that I learned so much from you as your PhD student is this economy of being really purposeful in your analysis. Have you always been this intentional in your analysis, and is that influenced largely by your supervisions as well?
Look, it's not possible as a scholar with integrity to be entirely intentional, right? Because what you end up being able to research and write, well, yes, it's partly due to what you set out to do, intention, but it's also quite largely partly determined by availability of resources or sources, what the sources actually tell you, right? And luck, very often. Right. So to say that you're entirely intentional would be misleading. If any scholar tells you that they've been entirely intentional, it means that they've been trying to massage their empirics to fit their theory. And I would advise you to be quite dubious about the study, right? To answer your question about supervision, I think I was incredibly fortunate, again, to be supervised by Rosemary Foote, but also to be nested within a generation of scholars in the Oxford department, who were, again, this incredible combination of, diplomatic historians, but also area studies specialists. This is, to me, that was normal, right? But increasingly these days, it's completely rare. What I tried to do, based on what Rosemary's work had brought me to, was to take it a bit further. And Rosemary's work taught me two really important things, right? That economy of expression. When you have 5 large boxes of archival material and you've understood it and you've mastered it, what do you do with it? Right? Is that analytical art, right? And Rosemary's great skill is in being able to tell a story with a great deal of integrity and a great deal of detail, right? But with a story arc to it, right? There is a purpose to the, and I tried to learn that from her. On top of that, I tried to make my story arc informed by concepts. Right. So the thing that I brought to it was the sharpening of the concepts and the pushing harder and utilizing of concepts. Yes, right? Yes. So for instance, in constructing the rapprochement, the US rapprochement with China, one example of this would be, my development of, that conceptual apparatus of images and competing images that were at play in the US establishment that really gives us the richness of understanding about how US perceptions of China changed, right? That difficult process of changing those perceptions that then allowed policy changes to be justified, right? Or to be expressed, or to be negotiated, right? That is mine. In that sense. And I thought there was unique value in that because that framework of competing images gives you a lens, not just to look at what Kissinger and Zhou Enlai, were able to negotiate with, not just that, but the framework of competing images also allows you to tie that to the prevailing arguments and contests that were already ongoing in the 1960s within the US establishment. Right. And it was really those competing images that then connected the pre-existing debates within the US establishment
Mm.
to what Kissinger then was able to latch onto, to give weight to a certain part of that debate,
Yes.
to a certain set of those images, to then help win the discursive
Right. Yeah.
contests.
Yeah,
Right?
right.
So that gives you that hook to understand the different parts of the process.
Yes. And the fact that I read your work and able to, you know, grab onto it and inspire my work is completely different, right? Because when I started approaching how Mahathir, you know, visiting China in 85 and also start thinking about those images and came back and started reconstruct a new set of China images that allowed them to, you know, transform the relationship, really makes, you know, a testament that it's not just relevant to that context, but it's actually applicable
Yes,
to
and
a
conceptual
lot
tools.
of different, yeah.
Yes, conceptual tools to be useful,
Right, yeah.
you know, should be transferable. They
Yeah.
should be not generalizable. I don't like that word.
Right, yeah.
Right, because when you say conceptual tools are generalizable, it leads us too close to the political science pretension that we can have one set of theories that apply in all contexts. I
Right.
don't mean that. I mean it exactly the way you've just
Right,
described,
yes.
which is that really useful conceptualizations, you know, should be intelligently adaptable to different contexts, to different
Right, yeah.
country diets, you know, as long as you're motivated by a similar set of driving
Yes.
questions. In this case, we are trying to understand, right, how radical policy reconceptualization can occur,
Right,
right?
yeah.
And we are resistant, both of us, to the idea that the realists try to persuade us, you know, into, which is that idea that, well, as long as the balance of power looks like it's changing, then states ought to behave in a certain way,
Yeah.
right? And in my own work, I've shown that that's not true. And
Right.
the way you show that that's not true is not by having some sort of esoteric theoretical debate about what states ought or ought not to do. Is to look at the empirics and to say, well, you know, here's a period in which the balance of power is changing. In my case, 1960, late 1960s, between the US and China, and then say, look at how the US officials responded to this perceived change in balance of power,
Yeah.
and show through the empirical evidence that actually they responded with 4 radically different groups of policy recommendations.
Yes.
Now, that empirical evidence is what I then use to say, well, you know, so to assume that what the realists tell us
Yeah.
is true is blatantly not true,
Right.
because here's what these policymakers at this juncture actually did,
Yeah. Right. Yes.
right? So there's only one way to cut through generic theoretical debates, which is to do the work,
Right. Yes.
do the empirical work.
Yes. Yes.
Right? Yeah.
What was your favorite thing about being in Oxford? Was it a pub? Was it the library? Was it the English school?
Look, Oxford is many different things, and and scholars and students and fellows have very different experiences, you know, of what is a very multifaceted place. I was incredibly fortunate to have experienced Oxford as an undergraduate, as a graduate student, as a DPhil student, and then as, you know, as faculty. You know, I was an Oxford Don, an unlikely one, you know, for 6 years. So no, for 4 years, sorry. And so my experience of Oxford is incredibly rich and incredibly multifaceted. But I think, and of course Oxford has changed as well. And so what I really particularly appreciated, as I said, was that I think I was incredibly fortunate to have been raised in academia in Oxford at a time when international relations was understood as this holistic discipline, right? Where you were not forced into theoretical camps, but rather the challenge was, how do we understand parts of the world, you know, with integrity, while being able to then use that knowledge of particular parts of the world to come back, you know, and to help to refine generic theories about the international as a whole, or you know, our understanding of the system as a whole.
Meeting the China challenge is another your key work that was published in 2005 that I think really addressed that balancing versus bandwagoning debate at the time. And what was it like at the time, being in the middle of this debate?
By the time I started the work that led to meeting the China Challenge, I was already based in Singapore, right? I had taken my first job as assistant professor at what is today the Rajaratnam School of International Studies. And it was very exciting. It was my, big postdoctoral project, which clearly was driven by, being located really at the heart of debates in Southeast Asia, in the post-Cold War period. So I really felt like I was living the post-Cold War transition. And the debate at the time was, of course, extremely driven by the Americans, right? Partly because academia was very American-centric in the 1990s and the early 2000s. It remained that way. And we in Singapore at that stage were really sort of growing a core of regional international scholarship that we felt at the time ought to more accurately represent, how regional policymakers, scholars, and people generally thought about these security issues, which were not necessarily the same as how American scholars and policymakers thought we should think about it. Right? And so it was a terribly exciting context. Of course, I was privileged to be able to work, with scholars, other Southeast Asianists like Amitabh, but also Kong Yuan Fong, let me put his name the correct way, and policymakers like Barry Desker and S.R. Nathan. It was, and my contemporaries, such as Helen Nessajurai, Melly Anthony, Ralph Emmers, Joseph Liao, names that, all students of Southeast Asian international relations would recognize today. So we were really the sort of, musketeers at the time almost in this. Now, meeting the China Challenge was really my frustration with how I felt the published work in the English language, right, largely in American outlets, did not reflect the reality of how questions about how to manage US-China competition, how these debates were being carried out in the region. And I was frustrated at how a lot of the work really was talking about what the United States was thinking, but masquerading, US thinking as regional thinking, right? I was very annoyed by that. And I was primarily annoyed at the charge that I heard a lot in different places in the West, where people would say, in a very casual way, oh, Southeast Asians have no strategic thinking, right? Or Southeast Asians have no strategy. And to me, this was blatantly untrue. And what I was trying to show in meeting the China Challenge, but also in the subsequent works on Southeast Asian strategy, what I was trying to show was Southeast Asians have strategies. They just don't strategize the way Americans, or other strategic studies scholars thought strategy should occur.
Right.
So that was my main purpose.
Yes.
In meeting the China Challenge.
Yes, and I thought that's really, describe how you as a scholar, being in your environment, react to your environment, interact to your environment as well, and especially being in Singapore as a hub. And obviously, one of the biggest contribution of that particular study is hedging, is the concept of hedging, because you really fleshed out how countries in Southeast Asia hedge. At the time when you conceptualize this work, what drawn you into this concept of hedging?
Of course, hedging is not unique to me,
Yes,
right?
yeah.
I mean, hedging was already in use to some degree. Not as much as today, but it was already in use to some degree by the time I published or I started working on what eventually became Meeting the China Challenge. And it was being used in a variety of different ways and applied to a variety of different countries, including the claims that the US was hedging or that China was hedging. So it was already in use. And look, my general principle with concepts is very simple, right? Have a really, really good understanding of the empirical phenomenon that you're trying to explain on its own terms, then find a conceptual label that most accords with the empirical phenomenon on its own terms that you're trying to describe. And so, using that principle, hedging made most sense to me, right? Things like soft balancing are inappropriate because the key referent point of something like soft balancing is balancing, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Still.
And that places an inappropriate emphasis on one end of the spectrum of activities that Southeast Asian states were using as instruments in their strategy. So that's why soft balancing just didn't work, right? Hedging had the added advantage of being a concept and a word that was actually used by Southeast Asians themselves. Okay, and that's, of course, important. It doesn't mean they meant the same thing with that word, but it had some resonance because of that. Yeah, and so, but when I looked around at how hedging was used by different interlocutors, it was clear to me that, some analytical work and refinement was necessary for that, and so I put in the work to refine it. But again, the way I did that was not to say in the abstract that hedging ought to mean this. I didn't do that. I did the empirical work. And then I tried inductively from understanding the empirical to then derive something that generically I thought captured how different Southeast Asian states and policymakers conceptualized what they were doing.
Yeah, and obviously your work has always been very empirically rich and driven by this desire to really understand the empirics. But I spent a bit of time in Singapore, and obviously people who want to understand the region needs to be in the field. But it's not an easy task because being in the field, you are bombarded by a series of information. You are basically being in the middle of debate that shapes you, perhaps influence you. And how did you manage that? Especially in these pieces that are very, empirically rich. How did you manage that and maintain your ability as a scholar to reflect on the empirics and derive concept from that?
There's no easy way to do it. Yeah, and I think, and I often say this to graduate students who come and ask me for advice. The first very important principle is to have a great deal of respect, right, for the people whose ideas you're trying to understand, or whose practices you're trying to understand. And respect means that you don't go into an interaction, posing a very narrow question to which you expect a certain set of preset answers. It's not a multiple choice, exam, right? Respect means that you take time and you think before. Well, it means you prepare beforehand. You find out as much as you can, right? For example, about Vietnamese strategic thinking before you rock up in Hanoi, right? And you talk to other scholars beforehand. You try and make sure that your understanding is accurate. Then you have to spend a great deal of time preparing. If you've never done fieldwork before, somewhere like I'll stay with the Vietnamese example. If you've never done fieldwork before in Vietnam, do not rock up and expect that people are going to tell you stuff, right? Talk to other scholars, your seniors or your teachers, about what are the contextual peculiarities of doing interviews in the place that you're going to. You know, try and learn from others who have more experience than you. First, for example, give enough time. Understand that if, for example, if you're just a PhD student, people have very little incentive to want to talk to you, right? So you have to find ways to ensure that first you gain their time, and secondly that you gain enough of their comfort where they will tell you things that they actually think, rather than telling you things they think you want to hear. Which is, you know, telling you things that they think you want to hear is the quickest way to get rid of you. You need to know that as a researcher. Right? So a great deal of agility, persistence, humility, and sincerity is incredibly important in these interactions, especially in some Asian contexts, right? So taking a different example, I vividly recall my first research trips to South Korea, right? Which Northeast Asia, apart from China, came to me a bit later in my career. And so I was already, you know, an associate professor by that point. I was a published scholar, and when I first started doing work in South Korea, and I would turn up to these interviews that my colleagues and friends had very kindly helped me to organize, and I would say to the South Korean senior scholar or policymaker, the first thing I would say is, please forgive me, I know very little about South Korea, and it's because I'm coming very late to your country, and I know nothing, and I'm sure that what I'm about to ask you is going to sound really stupid. Right? And please correct my question if you feel that I've asked you something which doesn't make sense to you. Right? But I'd really like to know, then I'll ask a general question. And this often helped. It really helped because, you know, your interviewee understands your humility and your sincerity, and that what you're there to do is to learn. You're not there to try and pigeonhole them into some, are you balancing or bandwagoning? Right. I mean, that's an absurd question. It's like setting somebody a multiple choice exam. Right? You don't ask, are you balancing or bandwagoning? You say, you ask, you know, the more generic questions about, you know, how do you perceive the competition between the US and China today? How do you think that, you know, your country's dilemma, right, between your economic relationship with China and your security relationship with the US, how do you think that has changed over the last 10 years? You ask questions like this. You don't present boxes to people and tell them, can you jump into one box? Yes.
And one aspect that I also want to highlight is obviously this comparative element. Because you compare 3 cases. And obviously one of those cases is Singapore, and you being Singaporean. When you wrote that piece, were you self-aware that, oh my God, I want to make sure that I'm able to compare this apple to apple and not just, you know, leveraging so much on the Singaporean case? Like, what was your approach to this comparative perspective at the time?
It was very, very difficult. And so I did Meeting the Challenge when I was on a fellowship at East West Center, Washington. Very, very lucky at the time to be able to work with Mutaya Alagapa, who was at the time director of East West Center, Washington. And I remember Mutaya gave me a really hard time. Mutaya was one of the big comparative scholars of Southeast Asia, right? One of the titans of the field. Mutaya's like, I'm not convinced by your 3 country cases. You know, your case selection doesn't seem to me to work very well. And so we had lots of back and in the end I got my way. But you know, it was difficult to convince him. And what I was trying to do in that was I couldn't be comprehensive, right? I couldn't do a country by country comparison because of limited time and expertise. What I really wanted to do was to particularly have a chance to explore, you know, a case like Singapore, where Singapore's not interesting because it is my country. That's not the point. Singapore is interesting because it is the one Southeast Asian country with the most consistently, coherently articulated strategic thinking,
Yes.
right? And so I wanted to compare a country like that with a country at the time like Vietnam, right? Don't forget, Vietnam, late 1990s, early 2000s. It's not the Vietnam of today, right? It was difficult to get access, to essentially the Vietnamese Communist Party. It was difficult to understand political debates within Hanoi.
Right.
And it was also very difficult to reconcile, Vietnamese political ideology with what it was undergoing, very rapid change.
Yes.
In Vietnamese, approaches to the region,
Right.
and also how the Vietnamese were articulating their foreign policy strategies.
Right. Yeah.
And so I wanted to be able to show in Meeting the China Challenge that Southeast Asia consists of a very wide variety of countries, of strategic thinking, and of the space they had to articulate the strategic thought.
Yes.
And this thing is really important. It's not that some Southeast Asian countries have more strategic thinking than others.
Yeah.
No, it's not that.
Right.
They're all strategic thinkers.
Yes. Yeah.
But there's often different domestic political constraints on how debates and articulations of strategy can be expressed.
Yeah.
Right?
Interesting.
That's the variation.
Yeah. And obviously, one of the things that you said, when this really, really established scholar tells that, oh, your case and your work and your thinking might not quite work.
Yeah.
How do you have that kind of convictions that, no, this is going to work? Because, obviously in the field, you need to develop that sensibility and that ability to distinguish when to listen and when not to listen.
Well, the first thing is then to listen, right? So it wasn't that Mutaya Alagapa said, Evelyn, I don't think this is going to work. And I said, no, it will work. Mutaya said, I'm not sure that this is the best case selection. And I said, okay, Mutaya, can I explain to you why I've chosen these? And please, can you explain to me why you think it's not good?
Yeah.
And if it's not good, what would you replace?
Right.
What would you replace these cases with? Right? And so we had quite a long series of discussions, not just one discussion, but a number of different discussions. And in the end, it wasn't that I said, okay, I don't care, I'm going to do this anyway. In the end, I said, okay, Mutaya, I agree with you that these are the three key, selection criteria.
Right.
Or we agree that these are the three key selection criteria for these cases. And I think that my three cases meet these selection criteria.
Your next work that I really like would be The Great Powers and Hierarchical Order in Southeast Asia, published in 2008. And obviously, for me, one of my favorite thing would be how you explain about the U.S. hegemony, but actually from Southeast Asia perspective. How did you approach this article, particularly this international security article, and what was the experience like writing and publishing this article?
Well, the first thing to say, of course, is that there was, I had a body of what I called my major body of first postdoctoral work, right? And it was this body of work on Southeast Asian strategies. So Meeting the China Challenge was the first step, right? In doing the three case studies in depth. At the same time, I had also the good fortune of being based in Singapore, was able to pursue a couple of projects on edited volumes, that also allowed me to explore comparatively other Southeast Asian cases, right? On this question of how Southeast Asian states were thinking about and responding to the changes in US-China dynamics in the post-Cold War period. And so the international security piece that eventually came out in 2007, 2008 was really accumulation of all that work, right? And what I was trying to do in the international security piece was to present a great deal of complex empirical material,
Right, yeah.
but also to cap it with the conceptual implications of that empirical material. Okay, so this has always been my aim, right? I'm not satisfied simply with saying, hey guys, you've missed all these really interesting things that people are thinking and doing.
Yeah.
Because I'm not convinced that that in itself is the maximum of what you could do when you are a really thorough empirical scholar. I think you can do more. You can say, hey guys, you're missing all these interesting things. And by the way, when you miss these interesting empirical things, you actually theorize wrongly.
Yeah.
Okay? And here's how to theorize better when you understand the empirics well. So that was what I was trying to do in the international security piece. So I did two things in that piece. First, I tried to accurately conceptualize and label the thinking and action that was going on. So you will notice in that piece that I don't actually center it on hedging, right? I center it on omni-enmeshment, complex balancing, as the key descriptors of what comprised Southeast Asian strategies, right? And what I was trying to do there is to actually accurately capture the empirics on their own terms.
Right.
Okay, so omni-enmeshment was my label for what many, many Southeast Asian practitioners described to me they were doing.
Yeah.
Okay, and that I could see in empirical terms they were doing. And complex balancing was also my descriptor for what, empirically I could observe.
Right, yeah.
And then the hierarchical order part was the so what part.
Right, yeah.
Right? It's like, okay, so we know about Southeast Asia, why should we care?
Right.
Well, we should care because even though they're small or medium-sized states, they actually have order ambitions.
Right.
And because cumulatively their individual strategies and collectively their regional institutional strategies are facilitating the creation of a particular kind of regional order.
Right.
It's not just that we should care equally about small and big states. I'm not making that argument. I'm making the argument that in this case we needed to care about Southeast Asian strategies because with great intentionality and with some efficacy, their strategies were actually helping to bring about explicitly a certain kind of regional order.
Struggle for Order. That's one hell of a book. It's probably for me, reading it several times, one of your most theoretically ambitious book. Even one of my favorite chapters will be the memory regime chapter, and I felt like reading it is like understanding a mosaic that you put together. And what was it like conceptualizing this book?
It was very, very painful. There is a reason why it's called The Struggle for Order. And I knew I wanted to write this book because it made perfect sense to me once I started, as I said to you, learning more about Northeast Asia, that I had to write a book that was about the post-Cold War struggle for order across East Asia, right? Although Southeast Asian states had a disproportionate influence in conceptualizing and pushing towards this regional order, of course they didn't do it by themselves, right? And so the struggle for order for me was a logical next step to explaining post-Cold War East Asia that would include the great powers, the Northeast Asian countries, as well as the Southeast Asian countries. And it really does upset me when people who have not read Struggle for Order then say to me, oh, your book about Southeast Asia. I'm like, what book about Southeast Asia? So it is the East Asia book. And the way I thought about it was that, the thematic approach of the book had to actually reflect the multiple dimensions, right, of how order is primarily conceived and battled over in East Asia as a whole, right? Which is why you then get the way the chapters, the core chapters are organized, right? There's clearly, unique to this region, a very particular kind of fight over institutions, right? So there is a chapter on institutional bargains, not about institutions per se, but institutional bargains, and how those are central in East Asia in this period for negotiating the new regional order. Then there is a chapter on regionalism, right? But regionalism thought of in the East Asian way, right? In which I actually chose to focus on financial regionalism. Not trade, which is what everybody expected that chapter to be on, but financial regionalism. Because in my assessment, the financial governance realm was really what needed to be built from scratch in the region. And therefore, that's where you can find the struggle for order, the contestation over order most acutely, much more than trade. That's why that regionalism chapter is about finance, which was very painful for me because I had to learn it myself properly, And then, of course, as you say, the history and memory, the memory regime chapter, but before that, the chapter on regional conflicts, right? And again, it wasn't a chapter about regional conflicts per se. It was a chapter about management of conflicts and actually about great power responsibility and great power management of conflicts, which was really the main chapter that allowed me to think about the interaction between non-great powers in the region, their expectations of what great powers are supposed to do.
You obviously continuously build upon and accumulate your experiences and your work. And in your last book, Sino-Japanese Alienations, that bargain framework, I felt like, is these accumulations of things that you've said before, of the empirical work that you've done, of the thinking about that concept of negotiations, bargain, and social compact. Before we talk about the book itself, how would you reflect on that kind of evolutions of Evelyn Goh methodology?
This 2020 book with Barry Buzan is, in terms of scope, my most systemic book, right? Because the aim of the book is actually to explain large swathes of Northeast Asian order over an unfeasibly long period of time and also into the future, right? So in terms of scope, it is the broadest. And so the framework that you find, the great power bargain framework, or the strategic bargain framework that I developed for my part of the analysis in this book, it's in many ways the one that has had to do the most work, because it has had to grapple, not with one dyadic relationship, but actually it has had to grapple with vastly different regional orders, and it has had to grapple with vastly different purposes, right? So it's one framework that has to explain regional order from 1400, right, all the way through to the contemporary period, but it's also a framework that has to help inform our projecting analysis of 4 scenarios for an East Asian order going forward, with or without US hegemony.
And when we talk about being systemic, one of the things that I learned, systematic, one of the things that I learned from you is the table, the famous table, that obviously we can see when you explain your bargain framework. We can see in the other piece like contesting hegemony, and we can see that how over time, this is one key feature that you use in your writing. What was it about the table that helps you think, and where did you get this? Well, is this like your thing, or you actually inspired by other scholars and use their approach?
Yeah, I think so. Amir is right. In all of my major works, you will find a table, at least one table, usually more than one table, that at strategic junctures of the work, especially when it's a large piece, tries to provide a helpful summary, comparison, or overview, right, of how the framework is utilized, to what effect. I did it in my master's thesis, 2 master's theses, and I did it in my DPhil thesis, and I've continued ever since because I find it to be effective. I like to have an overarching view of the big picture, even as I deal with the minutiae.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that gives you, as Amir says, a systematic idea of your purpose, but it also gives you an overarching sense when, say, you're trying to make an argument about what this part of the paper does. It still allows you to retain a view of the overall picture of the paper so that you can then talk intelligently. I've also found tables to be incredibly helpful when you're trying to illustrate when I'm trying to illustrate how my particular approach differs from how people normally think about it, or how my approach differs from the theoretical assumptions that are usually brought to bear in other analyses of the same thing. So I use this in the China's contestation of US hegemony security studies article in 2019. It was very, very helpful to be able to contrast my international society, approach that emphasizes authority, that emphasizes social compact, that emphasizes bargaining, to compare that in a table with the regular realist approaches.
And obviously, one of the fascinating thing when I read the book, and I saw, wow, this is a really, really ambitious book, not just because the long history that you were like tackling, but also these 2-level bargains, the constitutive and regulative bargain that you are trying to really, show and demonstrate throughout this long history, right? And are you, as a person or as a scholar, inherently ambitious? And when you grapple with this ambitious project, did you get nervous about, oh my God, will I ever master this long history?
I don't think I'm an ambitious person in that sense. I don't think I'm ambitious in the sense that I don't set out to say I want to write a book that is 3 times the length of a normal book just because it's cool. I'm not ambitious in that way, but very often I find that I start a project and I realize that if we want to understand the significance of the work, we have to do a lot more empirical work, and then B, we have to do the extension work, right, of conceptualizing to make its greater significance clear. And that's why things tend to grow when I do them. And I think that's just, and again, it comes with having an interest both in the micro and the systemic. Right? Some people do work where they are simply interested in the micro and they do it very well. Some people, in IR particularly, simply want to do systemic and to keep it at a certain level of generality. I want to do both. And so very often when I talk to people about my bigger pieces, I realize that they've not actually read the whole thing. So there are some tricks, right, in reading my work. So many people read the international security piece and they think it's just about omni-enmeshment and complex balancing. You'll be shocked at how many people will cite that piece without actually realizing that an equally significant contribution of that piece is the hierarchical order modeling at the end, right? Similarly, with struggle for order, many people don't know that the major model of the layered hierarchical ordering and the social processes that go with that actually occurs in the concluding chapter. Okay? Because that's unusual. They expect any modeling to occur in the introduction. Right? And so even though you say at the front, the model is in chapter 6, people don't read it.
Yeah.
You know? So this for me is a source of personal frustration, because apparently we don't train people anymore to actually be able to read a scholarly product on its own terms. And that's a source of great disappointment to me.
Yeah, and being so accomplished and wearing different hats. Do you ever sleep, Evelyn?
Of course I sleep. Not as much as I would like to. But on the other hand, I don't work as much as I feel I should either.
Thinking about how the regions change, what keeps you at night? What worries you at night?
I think that what has worried me all along, and I will trace this back to my early post-doctoral years, what has always worried me is the United States.
Yeah.
To me, the great uncertain factor in East Asian security and East Asian order is the staying power of the United States. I don't mean that the region cannot have order or security without the United States. It can, it has, and it will. But because we are in the contemporary system, the incumbent order that we're working with is one that is, with regional complicity, so reliant on US hegemony.
Yeah.
Anything that transitions away from that will be necessarily unstable.
Right.
Or anything significant that erupts in a system like that will inherently depend upon US commitment and US response. And so to me, this is a regional order that has a single point of failure. Right? No, it's not the fault of the United States. Again, there's a great deal of regional complicity towards this. And so the United States, the uncertainty about the United States is what has always worried me. Which is why today, increasingly, and I've always done this, I've always gone around the region saying to people, you need to think about how you are going to manage your own security and regional security when the United States is no longer there. I've said this from the earliest days of my career. And today, of course, that question is way more important.
Right. And I guess this is my final question for this episode. As a Southeast Asianist, what will be your advice for someone like me, for scholars who want to understand the region?
There's no way around it. There's simply, you must do it through a process of very hard work, a lot of time spent on the ground, a lot of commitment to asking what may be for you the same question, but in a multiplicity of different ways. Because the realities on the ground are very complex. Yeah. But it is your job as the scholar to help your interlocutors on the ground to reveal that complexity to you. It is not your interlocutors on the ground's jobs to explain that complexity to you in a way that you can understand.
Yeah.
There's a very big difference there. Yeah. And I think understanding that difference is what sets apart the successful researcher from the unsuccessful one.
Well, thank you so much, Evelyn.
You're welcome.
And I hope I can see you again next time.
All right. Yeah. Pleasure.
Bye, everyone. This is Southeast Asianist.